I'm going to thank all the organizers of this class. So on behalf of both John and Chess, this Belgian institute dedicated to fight against anti-Semitism, this GAP, which is based in New York City as well as Cambridge in the UK, with Academ, Le LICRA, with the support of the Réseau Herrera, which is a university network against anti-Semitism. I am happy to welcome Georges Bensoussan, who, in my opinion, is the great specialist today of the question of the Jews in the Arabic world. So the question of Middle Eastern Jews. So we're organizing a cycle dedicated to this question, this essential question to the understanding of the Israelo-Palestinian conflict and its resolution. Last week, I had the honor of opening the conference cycle by reminding the terrible 20th century, which was the century of ethnic cleansing and genocide. And we are honored today to invite Georges Bensoussan. I don't need to introduce him. You all know him. And I suggest we start directly the second session, by thanking everybody again and reminding my friend George, which should speak between 30 to 35 minutes, to then leave the floor to a debate. I'm sure you will have a lot of questions for him, and the debate will be organized by Erika Liebert, who is our mission agent and has been working with the Jonathan Institute since January 5th, 2025. So, George, you have the floor. Very well. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, everybody. Tonight's question is not the exclusion of the Jews of the Arabic world, but why this question has become a question that we have forgotten. You know what happened. That's not tonight's topic. Ethnic exclusion of the Arabic world after 1945. All Jewish communities disappeared. Some of them were excluded by an open segregation and very rarely by an expulsion, except for Egypt. But at the end of the day, in 25 years, 1 million Jews of the Muslim Arabic world have disappeared. They were often millennial and bimillennial communities. In the case of Morocco and Tunisia, this ethnic exclusion did not leave a lot of trace in history, and it was accompanied by a huge spoliation when we try to evaluate the amount. The question is, why has this question been under the radar of historians? Why was it not the first subject of a certain number of political debates? But first of all, there's the statue of Jimmy that characterizes the condition of the Jews and the Christians since the 7th century. And this left a very strong psychological footprint. We're talking about ethnic exclusion of the Jews by instilling a climate of fear. We were in presence in all these societies where Jews were minorities of a submissive attitude based on a doctrinal anti-Jews, which ethnicized in the 1920s and became fascism in the 1930s under the influence of Europe. Today, this anti-Judaism is part of these Muslim brothers, which was created by San al-Banna all the way to Sayyid Qutb, who was his successor, starting in 1950, and the latest one who just died, L'Imam al-Qardani, who just died in Qatar. It's a statute of protected. Ladima means protected, which means that an individual is under the protection of two. It's only about Christians and Jews that they protect from violence, the violence from the Muslims. It's Muslim statutes that protect against Muslim violence. It's a statute of minority. If I'm protected by my neighbor, it means I'm not really his equal. And it's a statute that's characterized by a constant humiliation that the Christians and Jews had to suffer for centuries. There's a lot of testimonies on that. I will only quote about the Marrakesh Jews, William Lampriere, the Englishman, who talks about the Jews saying that they're treated by the Arabs with more harshness than they would treat their animals. I would only talk about Chateaubriand in his itinerary from Paris to Jerusalem, who has extraordinary words about the condition of the Christians and Jews in the Holy Land. There are many others. We could spend hours quoting texts. But what's important is that out of all these testimony, whether they come from writers, I'm thinking about Lamartine and Flaubert and Narvan, and Chateaubriand, thinking about the diplomats, the doctors, the militaries who went through these regions in the 19th century. They all are witness of the same reality, this reality of overwhelming. And they did not, I'm thinking about those one who is going to be a big ecclesiastical of the end of the 19th century, and I forget his name. It will come back to me later. In the Middle East as well as in Maghreb, what's striking is that in the common tradition, when you say the word Jew, it's as if you were using a bad word. And in the Middle East and in Palestine, for instance, you use bad, minak, which means um, with all the respect, with all due respect. And in Maghreb, it's not exactly the same expression. After saying the word Jew, you say the word khashak, which means the same thing. Sorry, forgive me for, with all due respect. Sorry, Mr. Bensoussan, could you please speak a little slower for the translation? Yes, it's true that it's very fast, but since I was told 30 minutes, it must be a little too fast for the translation. Sorry for interrupting you. Thank you. No, you're right. Unfortunately, it's due to a time restriction. What's also striking is the logic of valuing the Jews in the Muslim universe in all sources of archives that we are from the 19th century, from Morocco to Iraq, going through Libya and Tunisia. We see that Jews are perceived as women. In Morocco in the 1920s, for instance, it's very neat in the French police archive. A Jew is like a woman, not the French police, but the French police is saying that in the Moroccan world, that's how they see the Jews, which means that Jews are being devalued because woman he belongs to an inferior status. The psych economy of the Jews in Muslim land has always been a psychological economy marked by servitude. For example, in Yemen, some agents from the Universal Egypt, Israel people were sent to possibly open a school. And in his report, he writes that the Yahudi, which means Jew in Arabic, Yahudi for Yemeni Arabs, are the servant on whom you have all rights. You can hit them all the time just to appease your anger. Second example, in the psychic economy of servitude, what's striking, where women have to wear a veil, is that you forbid Jewish women to wear a veil. Why? Not to humiliate them, but to humiliate their husbands, the men, to show that a Jewish man is unable to protect their wives and to protect the women of the group. They're trying to humiliate them by showing the lack of power. And in the same way, in traditional societies such as Yemen, for instance, where a man is supposed to carry a knife on his belt, Jews are forbidden from carrying a weapon. And it's true also in other countries. So what's striking when you look at all these testimonies and all these archives, which are all which all agree, is that we are in presence of a mythology that is still going on, according to which Jews and Arabs were living in agreement, in harmony in these territories, and that this golden age would have been killed by French or Italian or English colonialism and later by Zionism. So in terms of mythology, let's talk about Algeria, for instance, where they often say that in Algeria, the Crémieux Decree in 1970, which made Jewish people French people without being consulted about it, would have separated the Jews from the Muslims. It's completely wrong, because in order to be separated, you would have had to be united before, but they never were united. There was no divorce because there was no marriage. Actually, what we saw was that the Algerian Jews renounce their special status, their specific rights, what we call lacha in Hebrew, the rabbinic law over civil law, family law, right to divorce, etc. But to the extent that the Crémieux decree would emancipate them from the Muslim control, they were happy to join the French people. So that's the first illusion. The second illusion was the denial of the repeated violences on these poor men. In a big part of the Arab world, that it's an illusion that Jews and Arabs lived in harmony, but it goes back to something bigger, to the fact that the Arab world has a hard time writing about themselves, and a lot of Arab writers have a hard time publishing their work, and they're often condemned to be exiled. So they publish um, their first book or their thesis. They go towards England, the United States, Canada, and other countries because they don't really have freedom of speech. There's no freedom of expression in the Arabic world. So it multiplies the mythology on itself, and they're prisoner of these myths and mythologies. And it's an Egyptian, Rajik Salil el-Kimni, who only 10 years ago, in August 1915, was explaining that, and I quote, "We're told that colonialism is the reason for our delay. It's not true. Unfortunately, our culture is built on lies, and this ruined our memory." End of quote. He's not the only one to say that. I'm thinking about Adonis, the Syrian poet, and other intellectuals from Maghreb who live in France and who are saying the same thing. Boilem Sansal, who's today incarcerated in Algeria because of his writings. Other mythology, the mythology on the welcome the Arabic world welcoming the Jewish refugee. That's not true. We have the example of Libya, Syria, including after 1945, where refugees were not welcome. Mythology also, for instance, in France, on the role of the big mosque of Paris during occupation. They said that it saved some Jews during occupation. Maybe some Jews hid in this big mosque. That's true. But there never was any voluntary policy, deliberate policy from the rector of the big mosque of Paris that depended on Algeria to save some Jews as such. And that's the reason why the big mosque of Paris never received the recognizing from Yad Vashem. Same thing about the myth of the Morocco Sultan who protected the Jews during Vichy. The Sultan did not persecute it, of course, but the Sultan did nothing to protect them except for his prerogative. He signed all the Vichy decrees. Would he have been able to oppose them? That's another story, but to say that he opposed them is wrong. So after the end of 1942, because he needed the American support in view of the future independence of Morocco. There's a certain number of myths that are being carried on up to today. So what's surprising is that when we wonder about the regime of mythologies, we have to recognize that the left Intellectually, the left play an important part in this. I'll come back to Albert Memmi, a Tunisian Jew born in 1920, who was an anti-colonialist militant when he was young. And in 1957, when he was 37, 1 year after the independence of Tunisia, when he would have wanted to stay in Tunisia and he was a Tunisian subject, Albert Memmi finally opted to go to France, where he will become French a long time after he arrives in Paris. And he says, in a text that's already quite old, it's about 50 years old, he says that he was invited during the Algerian War. We're in 1957-58 in the salon of the Parisian left, and he hears that the Jews always left in perfect harmony with the Arabs. He was almost congratulated to be born in a country where racism and xenophobia was unknown. It made me laugh. I heard so many fallacies on Northern Africa that I did not really react to it. This started to preoccupy me when it became a political argument. So since 1967, the Arabs would use this counter truth, which is in a very favorable context. George, a little slower, and you can speak longer. I will say above Albert Nemi's testimony, who his whole life remained a man from the left, we can have other reminders that show that the progressist left was blind to the Jewish past as well as the Christian past in Arab country. And we can see that it's not much in favor of Eastern, Middle Eastern Christian. The progressist left did not want to see the dimension of Islam in Algerian war. The Journal of Evelyn was in El Ujaim, and it was translated by the combatant, but it meant the jihad fighter. The jihad is at the heart of the national fight of Algerians. So this blindness is the same about the progressive departure of Middle Eastern Christians and the ethnic purification of the Jews in the Arab world, as if it were an embarrassing topic, something that could not be examined. And why? Because as a former colonized territory dominated by French or other colonialism, the Arab world could not have been an oppressing world, imperialist world, a slaving world, anti-Jew and racist. But the Arab world was all of that, even if it was also dominated by colonialism. All this happens as if today it was a matter of not wanting to hurt the Arab world. For instance, slavery. When you look at the French history books today on the treat of slaves, you see that they emphasize mostly the Atlantic trade, the trade of slaves that was caused by Europe and that lasted 4 centuries and that was abolished in the 19th century by Europe. However, what we forget is that there were three trades. There was the Occidental trade, transatlantic, but also the inter-African trade, which made more than 40 million victims. Transatlantic would have made 11. And there's the Arabo-Muslim trade that lasted until the 20th century and very far into the 20th century with 17 million victims. These two trades, and specifically the last one, the Arabo-Muslim one, went completely under the radar of the school textbooks. And in May 2006, 18 years ago, a former socialist deputy in Guyana, Ms. Taubira, who was also a minister, said in the Express in 2006 that you have to avoid that the young Arabs will carry all the weight of the bad actions of the Arabs. And she explained why we should not insist on the Arabo-Muslim trade. For all these reasons, nobody heard about the hardship of the Jewish people. It remains, as you saw in the mediatic censorship in France, tried to do a documentary on the Jews of the Arab world and the way they were excluded in the in terms of an ethnic cleansing. You will not find any producer. I could give you some concrete examples later. And what the American university is exactly the same thing. We're in the presence of reports relatively idyllic relationship between Jews and Arab that colonialism on the one hand and Zionism on the other hand would have upset that. How could we explain this rewriting of the history until the current myth of the harmony between Jews and Arabs? This is both cultural and social phenomena. Let me explain. First vector of the golden legend of the Judeo-Arabic past, Ashkenazi Jews and the further of historiography modern. First of all, doesn't spend many pages on the Jews. Out of 11 volumes of his history, he only spends a few pages on the Oriental Jews. And he presents that as a more emancipated Judaism thanks to a bigger tolerance from the Muslim society. What is this presentation to try go towards emancipation by making it making the Muslim an example of tolerance? And I would like to quote Chateaubriand in 1806. He writes during his travel about the Islam law, do we want to know what this paradigm is? Every day something new, being threatened with being beat up and killed. And he talks about Greece because he went across Greece, which is not independent yet. If you look at Greece, you will know what happens to a people under the domination of the Muslims. This Ashkenazi history that soften the history of the Arab world. We have two examples of it today. On the one hand, it's what was the Aladdin Project. I don't know if it still exists, but it started about 15 years ago. The Aladdin Project, whose goal was to make people aware of the Shoah. They realized that Aladdin Project, in order to convey this history of Shoah in the Muslim world, had softened the history of Jews in the same Arabo-Muslim world. And in a way, everything happened as if in order to say a history, you modified another one. Second example is American Judaism, which is often Ashkenazi Judaism. And today, Jewish American historians, not all of them, we have historians who know about the subject. I'm thinking about Norman Stillman in the United States and others. But for instance, a historian who had his 15 minutes of fame a few years ago through a book that was his thesis that was published by Belin, it's Ethan Katz. Ethan Katz, who wrote a book on Judeo-Muslim relationships in France, in colonial France and contemporary France. And he put the American scheme on the colonial scheme and today's France. And as a result, he was completely besides reality. So he mythified the past to serve the illusion of living in good harmony. The example is Tam Camps, and quite a few people like him are the example of Pierre Bourdieu would call a knowledge that doesn't know itself as a knowledge. That's exactly what it is. The long silence around Middle Eastern Jews until today, despite the decision of the Knesset to make November 30th the day of Jewish refugees. from Muslim country. Not only this day is not very well known, but the history is not accepted. And I said that earlier. Take a certain number of movies about anti-Semitism produced by French television, and you will see how everything that has to do with Arabo-Muslim anti-Semitism is being mentioned, but very quickly talked about, just in passing. They're going to talk about the right right-wing extremism, talking about Front National, church tradition. All of this is true, except today in France, anti-Semitism is mostly carried on by other vectors. It doesn't mean that extreme right-wing lowered their anti-Semitism. So how to break the silence about this? There are two reasons. The first reason is a cultural deficit. Very often we have a very poor Judaism, except for Judaism in Iraq. And so Judaism that did not have many intellectuals in the beginning who could write about their own history. It's not true for Moroccan Judaism that went to Israel because it came without its community leader and without its intellectual who were able to write about this past. As a result, we had to do with Jewish communities where it's often the literate bourgeoisie that never felt the oppression that the little people felt. See Albert Memmi in his testimony about on La Statue de Sel in 1953. So this bourgeoisie never was victim of this Muslim violence, being hit, being insulted constantly. This literate bourgeoisie did not really speak about this history, and we felt that what they were saying was just the history of the Jews in the Muslim world. No, it was only their memory of it. And all of a sudden, we discovered this obvious truth that there isn't one memory, but several memories that are socially stratified. So they came from happy memories, and that's what remained because they were the intellectuals of this community. Third reason, in Israel, three-quarters of the Jews in the Arab world find a refuge in the Israel world because they became Israeli citizens. But the Israeli world that welcomed them in the 50s and 60s and even in the 1940s is mostly an Ashkenazi world that needed them, of course, because of the Shoah specifically, but that didn't see them and who reserved them a contemptuous welcome and sometimes very racist. And that's not new because under the Yemeni immigration history in Palestine, Ashkenazi immigration look at Yemeni very contemptuously and they do not hide their contempt. Not only these Jews were not welcome. They were treated with contempt. But on top of that, their suffering was added on upon the weight of the Shoah. So not only their own exile was minored, but also their own culture was looked at with contempt because their culture was all the more looked at with contempt that it was the culture of the enemy. So that brings us to a fourth reason that the victims themselves play a role in this omission that makes this question a question that has disappeared because of auto-censorship reasons. No group recognizes about themselves and willingly that they were submitted to a humiliated treatment because it's humiliating to remember this past. So there's a self preservation mechanism, and very often the one who is being dominated is the first one to deny his oppression. What is astonishing is that a very good sociologist, Janine Nerves-Leroux, who worked on the French of Algeria, and I think she published about 10 years ago a very nice book on the French of Algeria. She interviewed what they call the pieds noirs, Jews and non-Jews. And when she interviewed the Jews, she was astonished by the fact, by not a single speaker talked about the numerous attacks of the FLM against Jewish places. For instance, on the big synagogue, it had been completely vandalized. The furniture was broken. The Torah rolls were profaned, etc., etc. No one reminded it. And other elements as well, the verdict of the FLN against the Jews at the end of the Algerian War was not talked about by the French Jews who arrived in France in 1962 and who, in all good faith, had completely forgotten this past. And finally, the reason of this silence, the person oppressed has a tendency to idealize the past, and they're going to do it all the more as this past is part of their youth. The second point is that they're going to idealize the past all the more in a nostalgic speech, as then we arrive in Israel, they are so not welcome. They are made to understand that they're second-class citizens, and they tend to idealize this past where they lived in Morocco, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, etc. And they themselves are going to reenact this myth, which was not always a myth, because there are stories of friendship and conviviality, but always there's this contempt that's being carried by Quran and Islam towards the Jews. And there's also another reason, it's that the Arabic word Jewish historians, specifically the Sephardi ones, were immediately not considered. They considered that their work on the Arab world, because they were born there or because they were born in France, Canada, Israel, or somewhere else, was in fact soiled by the fact that they had this origin. So they were sent back to their identity. They were they had an identification assignment, which means that we considered that a Sephardi historian was not necessarily in the best position to talk about the history of the Jews in the Arab world. So this type of reproach was never heard for the big Shoah historians like Leon Poliakov, Raoul Hilbert, or Saul Friedlander. All three were victims of Nazism. All three are Ashkenazi Jews. All three are extremely good Shoah historians, and no one ever doubted their quality because they themselves were implied in the drama they reported later as historians. So these precautions were only for the Sephardic historians. So what we have to do is to do some history and to emancipate oneself, to try to understand why the Jews in the Arab world were the victim of such an ethnic exclusion, and when does this go back to? So we tend to think about the Israelo-Arabic conflict. Of course, it made it worse. It added fuel to the fire. But actually, the deep reason of the departure is not this. It goes before that, because the Judeo-Arab conflict in Palestine really burst for all the Arab world during the riots of 1929. Before 1929, during the beginning of the British Mandate or the Balfour Declaration, it's not yet a conflict that has an impact on the Arab world. After 1929, it does. The reason why the Jews leave the Arab world go before 1924. And why are they? They're due to the progressive emancipation of the Jews from the Arab world, an emancipation that was brought by school, and specifically by the school of colonization. Whatever the colonization, whether it was English, Italian, Belgian, etc., through the school, but also through the school of Universal Israelite Alliance that created from Morocco to Persia 45,000 pupils every year, and by the Christian religious, where a lot of Muslim and Jewish kids went to school. Through school, the Jews from Arab world started emancipating themselves and started to incorporate what was the Article 1 of the Declaration of the Human Rights. Article 1 that said this: every man are born free and equal in rights. So for a Jew or a Christian that live in Islam country, it's a revolutionary concept. So we saw the birth of the Jews as a political subject to a psychological liberation, and that's the deep reason of this. This liberation was not to be heard in an Arab world where it was um, a benchmark. This is part of the basis of Islam. And once this base is being questioned, it is as if all the balance in the world were being imbalanced. And we're talking about a form of Arab resentment where as if all the emancipation of Jews was at the origin of the decline of their world. And all this led to the disaster and the departure we know. I'm going to conclude in a few words to say that when we're in the presence of such a history that has been denied so much, we understand that we often make a lot of efforts, not just to see and understand, but on the contrary, to not see and not understand. It's Saul Bellow, the American novelist, who was talking about the intelligence deployed to not understand, how intelligent you had to not understand. So you have to try and understand and to accept the reality, the denial of reality. We tend generally, when we don't want to understand or not see, we tend not only to not understand against ourselves, but often we think in order to not offend our contemporaries. What scares us most is to be alone, is to be isolated from our peers. As also say, French spirit, which is naturally lazy, likes to avoid pain by not antagonizing others. That's the first point. The second point is that towards the Jews in the Arab world, we are faced to the same intellectual blindness as the communism towards Gulag. Everybody is struck by the disproportion between the condemnation of Nazism and its horrible crimes, and at the same time, leniency, which spares the crimes of communism and the horror of Gulag that lasted for decades and decades. It's Arthur Kessler's testimony, who was a permanent member of the German Communism Party, a very important member of it in the 1930s, who talked about a blindness, and that's what he says exactly, and that can apply to blindness towards the Jews in Arab world. I had eyes to see and the condition mind to eliminate what they saw. This inside censorship is more efficient than any official censorship, end of quotation, which brings me to say this, that a truth is only proven when it's audible. And just because a truth is proven, it doesn't mean that it's heard. The important is not what is true, but what is believed. And that's very true. So the fact to not see is something universal. When I say it's universal and that it goes back, I go back to the Bible in Isaiah books, this famous passage. They have eyes to see, but they don't see. Which goes back to Bergson's phrase. The eye perceives only what the spirit is ready to understand. So we tend to not see, and specifically the dominated do not see the domination to which they're subjective for a certain number of reasons I mentioned earlier, because generally speaking, we prefer to console ourselves with beautiful stories rather than to face a reality when it's tragic. And I will stop here. Thank you. No, thank you very much. It was extremely interesting. If the audience has question, the floor is open. You can raise your hand in Zoom, maybe write your questions in the chat, or let us know that you want to ask a question to Professor Bensoussan. If nobody has questions, I have one. Go ahead. At the reading of a search Turk who's Iraqi and who's based in New York. Her name is Ela Sushol, and it's several manifests on a designation that I'm interested in as a linguist. She doesn't call herself a Mizrahi Jew, but an Arabic Jew. And I'd like to know whether in your researches you had found different nuances in terms of designation that claim this auto invisibility that you were mentioning before. Yes, I know, Lashowat. It's interesting. What he says is interesting because culturally speaking, she's right. She's Iraqi. Yes, the Iraqi Jews, but it's true from other Jews, Tunisian, Libyan, Moroccan, Syrian Jews, were Arabic Jews, culturally speaking. But when Arabic nationalism, starting in the 1920s and 30s, became more ethnic, they were rejecting because culturally they were Arabs, but ethnically they were not. And so Albert Nemi, who is a Jew culturally Arabic, his mother tongue is Arabic, it's not French. He learned French at school. But he said, we would have wanted to be Arabic Jews, but it's not our fault if they didn't want us. But actually, Ilujat is in denial when she calls herself an Arabic Jew because she forgets the Arabic world doesn't want her, and she reproduces the illusion of the Judeo-German symbiosis that we saw in German Judaism in 1933. So many German Jews wanted to be German to the end until the day learned that Germany did not want them, and it ended very poorly. Very well. So are there other linguistic names except for Mizrahi, Arabic Jews? I don't know if you know this work from an Israelo-American Jew, Ed Magzik, who did a manifest. That's not the Mizrahi's manifest, where he was claiming the opposite. We are not Arabic Jews, we are Mizrahis. It's completely true, and his analysis is correct. Mizrahi's Jews, I think it's Mizrahim, because Sephardic is something very restrictive. They're of Spanish descendancy. But the Mizrahim are Arabic Jews, but the Arab world did not want them. So we cannot talk about Arabic Jews anymore this day. Otherwise, it means we're living in denial. I see Mr. Alan Goldberg, who comments that there's a fascination regarding Islam in the Western world currently. Mr. Goldberg, could you speak? Where does this fascination come from? Could you elaborate? Or would you want to? Yes, good evening. Yes, simply we're observing some sympathy in Europe, even in the United States, a lot of conversions, some leniency that can be sometimes interpreted as condescending towards Islam in in the Western world, and often it's a fascination. Is it a Stockholm syndrome, or are there deeper reasons? But it's a question that we ask ourselves. What is your opinion, Mr. Bensoussan. I'm not an Islam specialist, but I see that too, and I agree with you that there's sort of a fascination in part of the elites, not all of them. There are some Western intellectual elites who have a true repulsion for Islam, what we call Islamophobia, and they're afraid of Muslim religion because of all its violence. So what I think maybe the hypothesis is that living in such intellectual and psychological destruction time and the loss of values in the Western world where we wonder what is the meaning of society, Islam offers a reference time frame um, that reassures a lot. And there may be a sort of tropism towards Islam, which is kind of nostalgia for a belief system that reassures and that frames. It's just a hypothesis. Thank you, Mr. Goldberg, and thank you, Professor Bensoussan. There's also Ivan Lazizolanov, who's asking in the chat how the Arabo-Palestinian refusal of the thriving Jew since the beginning of Zionism is the continuation of the profound contempt of the Arabo-Muslim world that you described. So possibly, is it the unique cause of conflict? It's a very important question. It's a key question, and Joel said it in his introduction. We cannot understand the extraordinary long perennity of this conflict that has been lasting for 114 years for a minor conflict that only has to do with 50 million of Jewish individuals that represent twice Belgium, for instance, or 5 French the departments. How understand such a longevity if not in terms of the Islam Code, which forbid all idea of national Jewish sovereignty and all idea of national Jewish sovereignty on this world because once it was Muslim. So the notion of Divma and the notion of suggestion of Jews under the Islam law is key to understand the perenization of this conflict. So this is a terrible drama in the Western world where this conflict, which is a real conflict with real victims, nobody can deny what's happening in Gaza, etc. That's true. This conflict has the appearance of conflict of fight for national liberation, who for some has the absurd concept of decolonization conflict. That is the appearance of conflict, national liberation. But there's a reality of the conflict behind that. It's the reality of the jihad. And that's what explains that whatever the Israelis compromises at the last minute, the Arabic party is going to say no to the Palestinian state because that would mean recognizing the Israeli state. And that's what explains that in 1937, in 1947, and more recently in 2000, and a little before after with Ehud Barak, the Palestinians refused the best Israeli concessions, including the east of Jerusalem and 90 or 95% of Cisjordania at the last minute. Arafat said no, because that would have meant accepting the Israeli national state, and that was out of the question. All the agreements that were concluded since Oslo were truce agreements and not peace agreements. And on a scheme that's completely obsolete, that's a decolonialism scheme, when the conflict is a lot more archaic than that, has the jihad at its heart. Thank you very much. I have 2 more questions. We're going to start with Alain Saresh, who's asking, it's a linguistic questions and semantic question. The term Nakba, did you choose this term for your presentation because out of provocation, and why apply to the Jews? a Nakba is something that was used by the Syrian historian in 1948 for the first time to talk about the catastrophe of the Palestinian exodus and the creation of Israel. And today, Nakba has become quite common word to use to talk about the Palestinian misery. We use this word Nakba to talk about this idea of a catastrophe. If there's a Palestinian Nakba, which is true, there's also a Nakba of the Eastern Jews. So it's just to say, if you're allowed to be recognized, we too are entitled to be recognized. And the history must be told and recognized so that we may also hear your history. So it's not a one-way thing. Jonathan Zafrani as well. You, yes, hello, thank you very much. I found this very interesting. I have a comment and a question. I come from a family, a Moroccan family, with a grandfather who wrote a lot about the Moroccan Jews, Reb Zofrani, yes, and who did not really transmit everything you're saying. His approach was more to say that there was a form of symbiosis between, at least that's how I read it, between the Jews and the Arabs. Maybe in the perspective of comparison, in terms of what was happening in Europe. And at the same time, I think there was a lot of things not said about the fact that all the Jews were lost. So he describes an idyllic situation, and we close our eyes to the fact that everybody left without wondering why. Yes, there's a contradiction. Yeah, there's a contradiction that was always quite strong in what is not said. So I'd like to thank you. I wanted to thank you for putting this into light in terms of what I lived and what I read from my family. Yes, you're right. You're right. Safrani did a lot of studies about the Moroccan Jews. He has this vision, which is not necessarily a gut vision. He was also talking about mountain Judaism, the schools, um, in the mountains. And what I said earlier, there could be also friendship and harmony between the communities. It wasn't a complete war. That's true. But you summarized the problem very well by saying if this harmony had been as idyllic, these communities wouldn't have left, and they all left, all of them. So they didn't necessarily leave because they fled oppression. Part of them left after 48 because the state of Israel had just been created, and it was the Messiah sign that was calling to them. That came into play, that's for sure. Would you like to continue, Mr. Zafrani? No, that's it. I will leave the floor to the other gentleman. There's another question from Mr. Azizullah. Shouldn't we, to go towards peace, work constantly to the destruction of this refusal ideology that is a barrier to all the path towards peace? The Abraham Agreement on the sign of the Islam evolution, which is possible amongst the Arab society that lead the dynamic of the failure and systematically go towards the towards the I think the Abraham agreements have a lot of limits, but let's not look horse gift in the mouth. We shouldn't have illusions as to what the mass feel, whether they're from Morocco or elsewhere. The anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish sentiment is very strong, but one thing is sure is that maybe the agreement may start a dynamic that may enable slowly to have the mentalities evolve. But we have to accept them and applaud, but we should not have too many illusions. We're at the end. Thank you, Professor Bensoussan, for your presentation. Thank you to all the audience. All of this session will be online in the next